Hi, I'm Jeff Kildare, and this is the first of a series of podcasts on Irish and Irish Australian history. This episode is called Where Crows Gather, which tells the story of Sister Liguori, a young Irish nun who in July 1920, fearful she was about to be murdered by her Mother Superior, fled her convent in Wagga Wagga and placed herself under the protection of the Orange Order. It is a remarkable tale, which, if written as a novel, would be considered too far divorced from reality to be acceptable as a serious work of fiction. Yet, it is a true story, full of tragedy and farce. After her escape, Sister Liguori, or Bridget Partridge as she preferred to call herself, was smuggled out of Wagga Wagga and taken to Sydney by Robert Barton, Grand Master of the Orange Order. But there, the police, acting on the information of her bishop, arrested her as a lunatic. However, amidst high drama, the Lunacy Court declared her sane and ordered her release. But the affair did not end there. Instead, it provoked the most bitter sectarian conflict in Australia's history. There were even fisticuffs in Parliament as Catholic and Protestant MPs debated the issue. Later, Bridget sued her bishop for false imprisonment, and if that was not enough, her brother arranged for her to be kidnapped in order to get her away from her captors or rescuers, depending on your point of view. So, let's get started. The story is set in early 20th century Australia, when Catholics were mostly Irish by birth or descent. The Irish were mostly Catholics, and Irish Catholics were mostly on the lowest rungs of the socio-economic ladder. This threefold identification of religion, ethnicity and class had been a feature of Australian society since the 19th century. And from the earliest days of European colonisation, Irish Catholics had perceived themselves as a persecuted minority. Whether or not Catholics were ever subject to persecution in Australia is debatable. Nevertheless, whatever may have been the reality, perception shaped the attitude that Catholics held as to their place in the wider community. And in early 20th century Australia, persecuted Catholicism was the orthodox Catholic historical interpretation. If ever there was a particular time in the history of Australian Catholics when this interpretation seemed justified, it was during the early 1920s, a period in which a series of sectarian controversies piled one upon the other in quick succession, threatened to tear the fabric of Australian society. In the words of New South Wales Attorney General Edward McTiernan, there was at this time a veritable hurricane of sectarianism, and at the eye of the storm was Sister Liguori. Born in 1890 at Newbridge, County Kildare, Bridget Partridge was the daughter of an English soldier and his Irish wife. She had 3 sisters and a brother Joseph, and in 1908 Bridget joined the Presentation Order at St Bridget's Convent in Kildare town. Within 3 months, she was on her way to Australia, where in 1911 she was professed at Mount Erin Convent, Wagga Wagga, taking the name Sister Liguori. At first she worked as a teacher. However, after an adverse report in 1918, she was relegated to domestic duties. Resentful of her demotion and suffering poor health, she came to the view that she no longer had a vocation, but, preferring to avoid the moral pressure which she feared would be brought to bear on her should she apply to be released from her vows, Sister Liguori brooded, allowing her resentment to grow. Eventually, a paranoid fear that she was about to be murdered by her Mother Superior triggered the nun's sudden departure from the convent. When the Mother Superior realised that Sister Liguori was missing, she alerted the police, who organised a search. However, the search was in vain, as Bridget had taken refuge in the nearby home of a Protestant family, and within 24 hours she had been spirited out of town and was on her way to Sydney in the company of Mr. Robert Barton, the Grand Master of the Loyal Orange Institution. After a few days, the Bishop of Wagga Wagga, Joseph Wilfrid Dwyer, who was responsible for the nuns' welfare, realised that Sister Liguori was no longer in the district. Acting on the advice of her doctor that she was mentally unhinged, the bishop instituted proceedings under the Lunacy Act for her arrest. Within a short time, the police ascertained where she was staying, and just before midnight on Saturday the 7th of August 1920, they called at the Cogra home of Congregationalist minister Reverend William Tutchell and took Bridget into custody, lodging her at the Darlinghurst Reception House. On the following Monday, Bridget appeared at the Lunacy Court, where T.J. Ryan, KC, the former Queensland Premier and at that time a member of the House of Representatives, announced to the magistrate that he appeared for Miss Partridge. Ryan had been retained by the prominent Catholic layman P.J. Minahan, MLA, who claimed to be a friend of Miss Partridge. However, Mr. F.B. Boyce of Council, who had been briefed by solicitors retained by the Orange Order, also claimed to appear for Miss Partridge. When Boyce challenged Ryan's right to appear for the nun, the magistrate remanded her in custody pending receipt of a psychiatric report. On the following Friday, the chief medical officer reported to the court that, in his opinion, Bridget was sane, and the magistrate thereupon ordered her release, allowing her to leave the court in the company of Reverend Tutchell and his wife. Outside the courtroom, a large crowd had assembled, and when news of the magistrate's decision was conveyed to them, it was greeted by cheers and boos from different sections of the gathering, with much heckling and pushing and shoving. This was only the beginning of what would build up to be a major public controversy. A controversy lapped up by an enthusiastic press eager to inform a scandalised public of the salacious details. That month, the Address in Reply debate in the Parliament gave the members of Parliament an opportunity to air their views on the Sister Liguori affair, with Protestant members speaking in support of Bridget's right to liberty, railing against Catholic institutions and demanding government inspection of convents to prevent young women being held against their will. Catholic members, in an equally strident manner, refuted the allegations made against the convents. In September, Thomas Henley, MLA, called on the government to appoint a royal commission to inquire regarding women in convents. And in November, he sought leave to introduce a private member's bill to provide security against detention of persons against their will in any institutions or by any persons. Catholic members responded with derision to Henley's thinly disguised attack on the convent system. And at times the debates became very heated, with P.J. Minahan declaring, "If you in any way interfere with these Catholic institutions, there will be a mess up here, worse than that which occurred on the plains of Flanders." At the close of one of the debates, members had to intervene to prevent physical violence between Henley and C.C. Lazzarini. While the politicians made what they could out of the affair, Bridget's private life was in turmoil. Bridget's younger brother Joseph lived in Hong Kong. In response to a cable sent to him by the Mount Erin Convent, Joseph arrived in Sydney on the 7th of September 1920. His arrival in Australia was accompanied by the sort of intrigue that might be expected in a John le Carré novel. To avoid his falling into the hands of the Orange Order, Joseph was taken off the ship at Townsville and transported by train to Brisbane, where Charles Lawler, Secretary of the Catholic Federation of New South Wales, met him and accompanied him to Sydney. All the while, Archbishop Dewey, kept Bishop Dwyer informed of Joseph's movements using coded telegrams. The Catholic Federation, which was acting in the affair on behalf of Bishop Dwyer, took charge of Joseph and made use of him to gain publicity in its campaign against Barton and Tutchell, whom it accused of detaining Bridget against her will. The Federation also launched a public appeal for funds to assist Joseph to recover his sister. Joseph, who was an accomplished musician, performed at many of these functions. There were some in the Federation who opposed these tactics, believing that because Joseph had come to Australia to return his sister to Ireland, he should not be paraded like a show puppy at publicity stunts. It was also being suggested that the Federation had in fact prevented Joseph from taking his sister home. Although by the close of 1920 publicity surrounding the affair had died down, it was reignited in the following year when on the 30th of June 1921, Justice David Ferguson of the Supreme Court commenced hearing an action for damages brought by Bridget against Bishop Dwyer, in which the former nun alleged that the bishop had procured her arrest and imprisonment without just cause. On the opening day of the hearing, a long line of men and women stood in the rain in King Street, Sydney, outside No. 5 Jury Court, waiting for the gates of the courthouse to open. When they did, there was a rush for seats, and the gallery quickly filled, and those who could not get into the court waited outside, hopeful of being admitted at some stage during the day. The parties were represented by the leading King's Counsel of the day, and over 10 sitting days, each side called a string of witnesses, including Bridget and the bishop, to narrate the sorry saga. During that time, verbatim accounts in the daily papers maintained the public's fascination with the case. At the end of the evidence, and after addresses by counsel and the summing up by the judge, the jurors were sent out to consider their verdict. After 7 hours deliberating on 3 questions put to them by the judge, they returned, finding on the first 2 questions that the bishop had not taken reasonable care to inform himself as to the true facts of the case, and that he had not honestly believed the case which he had laid before the magistrate. The outcome seemed inevitable. Surely Bridget had won. But, notwithstanding the first 2 answers, the jury found in answer to the 3rd question that the bishop had not been actuated by malice. This finding was critical to the outcome of the case, as malice was a necessary legal element of Bridget's claim. So that, despite the jury's findings on the other 2 questions, the judge was bound to enter judgment for the bishop. The Sydney Morning Herald described the reaction to the verdict of the huge crowd that had gathered outside the court. Volley after volley of cheers were given for the bishop, whose sympathisers could be estimated at about 10 to 1 in the sea of faces out in front of the court. On the following Monday night, Sydney's Catholics, numbering upwards of 10,000, filled the town hall for a meeting to celebrate the victory. Organised by the Catholic Federation and presided over by Archbishop Kelly, the meeting opened with the singing of Faith of Our Fathers. When Bishop Dwyer appeared on the platform, he was greeted by an outbreak of applause that lasted for several minutes, after which P.S. Cleary, president of the Catholic Federation, moved that this meeting of citizens records its appreciation of His Lordship Dr. Dwyer, Bishop of Wagga, and of the manner in which he has vindicated the dignity and responsibility of his position. The motion was enthusiastically carried. Father Maurice O'Reilly, Sydney's answer to the demagoguery of Archbishop Mannix of Melbourne, and never one to pass up an opportunity for hyperbole, hailed the result as a victory for the Catholic Church of Australia. Clearly the crowd lapped up the rhetoric, subscribing more than £1,500 to defray the bishop's legal costs. Apart from the occasional verbal forays by one side or the other, the affair appeared to subside. But Joseph Partridge was determined to remove his sister from the company of Barton and the Tutchells and to return her to Ireland. On the 26th of October 1921, while Bridget was walking along Chapel Street, Cogra, in the company of the Tutchells, after having attended a home mission festival, she was snatched from the street, bundled into a motor car and driven away. In the car was her brother. They were driven to the house of Dan O'Callaghan at Ashfield, where Joseph spent the night trying to persuade Bridget to leave her Protestant friends and to return with him to Ireland. The next morning, an alert policeman spotted Bridget in the city in the company of O'Callaghan. They were taken to police headquarters, where a meeting was arranged among various interested parties. At that meeting, Bridget made clear her desire to remain in the company of her new friends. This seemed to satisfy Joseph, who, shortly thereafter, departed Australia, leaving in his wake a further controversy which rekindled sectarian passions. Parliament once again became the scene of bitter exchanges across the denominational divide, with Sir George Fuller, the leader of the opposition, moving a censure motion alleging that the government had acted improperly in not having the kidnappers charged. Wagga Wagga was deeply divided over the affair. In July 1921, division turned to violence when Reverend Tutchell visited the area to establish branches of the Protestant Federation, a counterweight to the Catholic Federation. At meetings at Mara and Coolamon, Tutchell was assaulted and had to be rescued by police. A number of men were later convicted of riotous behaviour and assault. It is difficult today to understand how such passions could have been aroused, but at the time, Australian society comprised two communities. One was British in origin and Protestant in faith, the other Irish and Catholic. At a functional level, the two communities generally coexisted and cooperated peacefully and effectively. But viscerally, they were quite distinct and often in a state of tension. Competition between religions reflected not only theological differences but also complex ethnic rivalries, particularly those between Irish Catholics on the one hand and English Anglicans and Scots-Irish Presbyterians on the other, stretching back centuries. These chronic rivalries had become acute during the preceding decade owing to a combination of factors which I will cover in a later vodcast. Suffice it to say that events in Ireland following debate over the Third Home Rule Bill from 1912 to 1914, the Easter Rising of 1916, and the Irish War of Independence of 1919 to 1921 exacerbated local tensions over state aid for Catholic schools and conscription for overseas service during the war. By the end of 1920, the situation was so bad that organised Catholicism and organised Protestantism were lining up for a showdown, with some Protestants predicting a violent conflict. A correspondent to a Protestant newspaper declared, "Australia will be embroiled in a war such as that now being waged in Russia. In other words, Australia will have a bloody time with Bolshevism and Sinn Féinism arrayed on one side and constitutionalism and Protestantism on the other." Soon, however, the once notorious Sr Liguori Affair faded from public sight and eventually from social memory. By the mid-1920s, the flames of sectarianism had died down sufficiently so that only the embers remained, occasionally flaring up from time to time over the ensuing decades, but never again reaching the intensity of the early 1920s. For the most part, the two communities have since worked together to build the Australia we know today, where sectarianism, between Christians at least, has little, if any, influence over public discourse, and the labels Irish Catholic and British Protestant no longer functionally define sections of the Australian people. As for Bridget Partridge, she remained a member of the Tutchell household for another 40 years, before being admitted to Rydalmere Psychiatric Hospital, where she died on the 4th of December 1966. She is buried in an unmarked grave at Rookwood Cemetery. I'm sure you'll agree with me that the Sr Liguori story is a fascinating one that deserves to be remembered, if only to remind us of how Australia was once riven by sectarianism. In many ways it is a sad story, for Bridget was the hapless victim in a two-sided ideological tug-of-war then being conducted in Australia. Her predicament is not unique. We have seen it before in other cases. For example, in 2005 with Terry Schiavo over the right to die debate, and in 2000 with Elian Gonzalez over his repatriation to Cuba. It's a situation in which activists on both sides of an ideological divide pull at the hapless victim like children fighting over a rag doll, each side proclaiming its motivation as purely the individual's best interests. It is no wonder Bridget started to come apart at the seams, for 1920 was arguably the worst year in Australia's history of sectarian conflict. Looked at in the context of the hackneyed genre of the runaway nun, it was too good an opportunity for the militant Protestants like Barton and Tutchell to let pass by, while the Catholics felt the need to marshal their forces to neutralise the attack on the convent system. It was not a case of white hats versus black hats. Dark grey seems to have been the universal choice. That's not to say that Bridget was not well cared for by the Tutchells, although we don't know much about her life from 1922 to 1965. Nevertheless, the fact is that she remained as a member of the Tutchell household for so long and seems to have had a close relationship with Mrs. Tutchell. This indicates that she had found peace with them. Until next time, fare thee well.